Hello one, hello all. Welcome to the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast, the first and only podcast dedicated to the avenging adventuress of pulp fiction, the Domino Lady. I'm your host, Sam Oatley, and today we're going to be looking at the very first Domino Lady story ever written, The Domino Lady Collects. This story was published in the May 1936 issue of Saucy Romantic Adventures, which was also the first issue of the publication. This is going to be an interesting discussion because this is a story that establishes a lot of the groundwork for the Domino Lady, but it also has some notable deviations from the Domino Lady's characterization in her modern adventures, and even in the later original pulp stories. So there's going to be a lot to talk about this episode, so grab a snack if you want to watch this episode in one sitting. It's gonna be a long one. But before we get into our main subject, I first wanted to give you two updates. First, I wanted to point out that Airship 27 has released a new volume of Domino Lady stories. This will be Volume 5 for Airship 27's rendition of the Domino Lady. I've already ordered my copy, and I'll leave links to Amazon and Airship 27's catalog in the description. I will not be doing a review of Volume 5 on the podcast anytime soon, as I want to discuss the other Domino Lady volumes by Airship 27 first. But please check out Volume 5 if you're interested, and let me know what you think about it. The second update is about the rather long hiatus the podcast has suffered. As many of you know, the first episode released in April of last year, with the original plan being a new episode every month. However, May sidetracked me by both family commitments and sickness, so nothing happened those months. And just as I was getting ready to do The Domino Lady Collects in June, my family experienced an eviction. I don't mean they got evicted, I mean they evicted someone. Essentially, my deceased grandmother's old house had been taken over by vagrants, and my father and uncle had to go through the courts for 3 months to get them out. The eviction finally happened in the middle of June, but the squatters left the house in such a mess that it took 3 straight months to fix it. So yeah, I was doing a lot of work during those months and didn't really have the time to do many episodes. I managed to record another episode that originally focused on the Domino Lady Collects in early July, but I realized that I spent so much time talking about Lars Anderson and the various Domino Lady reprints that I could just do a single episode on those subjects. I also didn't like the section that focused on the Domino Lady Collects, as there were a few details missing and I felt I meandered a little too much in that first take. So the pulp reprints and Lars Anderson section was what I uploaded as the second episode, and I recorded this new episode for the Domino Lady Collects. I'm going to try and keep a consistent schedule from here on out, especially from now until June, as I want to talk about the 6 original Domino Lady stories ASAP before looking at modern stories. So without further ado, let's get into the Domino Lady Collects. One thing to keep in mind is that I'm going to spoil this story entirely, as well as all the other original pulp stories in their respective episodes. This is because they're pretty hard to talk about without spoiling anything, given their short length and very simple plots. Bernard Drew, who wrote the introduction to the Bold Venture Press Domino Lady collection, actually stated that the original Domino Lady pulps were so short and so thin with their plots that you pretty much had to spoil them to talk about them even in passing. Because of this, if you haven't read the Domino Lady Collects before, I recommend you pause this episode now to find a copy to read, either online or from one of those reprints I discussed in the previous episode. It's a fun romp, and I think you'll appreciate this episode more if you know the story beforehand. So to start, I'll summarize the setup for the story. Ellen Patrick has an old college friend named Eloise who has written compromising letters to lovers she was having affairs with, and which would be quite embarrassing if they got to her husband Lou. Unfortunately for Eloise, an unscrupulous character actor named Rob Wyatt has gotten a hold of the letters and is blackmailing her with them. Lou is a high-level Hollywood studio executive, and if he got wind of those letters, there would be some domestic trouble for Eloise. Ellen offers to get these letters back, but not in the way Eloise expects, because Rob Wyatt is going to get a visit from the Domino Lady. Right off the bat, the first few paragraphs are fascinating in how they set up Ellen Patrick as a character. For instance, these paragraphs introduce her waking up in bed, of course describing her tight nightgown since this is a spicy magazine. The third paragraph is the first time our heroine is named, but as the Domino Lady, not Ellen Patrick. The passage says, quote, "The Domino Lady, Hollywood's most mysterious female, was awakening." This is a fascinating choice because Anderson is slyly telling us that the Domino Lady is the true identity of this character, not Ellen Patrick. If you've ever seen any discussions about Batman, you know that a common saying is that Bruce Wayne is the mask and Batman is his real face. I'd argue that's in play here with Ellen and the Domino Lady because everything Ellen does in this story is guided by how it leads into her adventure as the Domino Lady. I wouldn't say the identity blurring is as pronounced with Domino Lady as it is with Batman, but this passage indicates that the Domino Lady is more prevalent in Ellen Patrick's mind than Ellen Patrick is. This intro is also a great character moment because as Ellen wakes up, she gets a phone call from Eloise, who's, freaking out and sobbing about the compromising letters, and Ellen doesn't even get off her bed pillow. She just lounges and tells Eloise to relax, saying her husband won't find out, she'll take care of it, and then just hangs up lackadaisically, all while contentedly puffing on her cigarettes. It's such a telling moment because you can tell that this is a very confident person. Ellen's not even worried about Lou finding out about the letters, because she already knows he won't ever hear a whisper of them, even before she's got them. It's such a blatant show of confidence, maybe even arrogance, that you're interested and impressed in this individual. You're left wondering, what's she got up her sleeve that she's treating this as a whimsical jaunt more than a big problem? It's a great hook to get the reader intrigued about both the overall plot and the Domino Lady herself. We also get some important minor information. Ellen's apartment is stated to be apartment 422, which implies it's on the 4th floor of the apartment building. The apartment is also located on Wilshire Boulevard, a major street that goes through Beverly Hills, Los Angeles, and Santa Monica. Anderson writes the name as Wiltshire with a T, but I suspect that this was just a spelling error. I doubt the street is meant to be fictional since Wilshire is a very well-known road, and it would make sense that the well-off Ellen would be living there. It is also stated to be springtime in the first paragraph, which is interesting because the story premiered in the May issue of Saucy Romantic Adventures. Perhaps Anderson was writing the story to take place in the season readers would be getting the issue? We also learn that Ellen has blonde hair and brown eyes, and we get our first hint of the story's spiciness when Ellen wakes up in bed and we get a line that describes Ellen's, quote, damp, cerise mouth deliciously shaped. A pretty tame passage by today's standards, but this was very hot stuff for a reader in 1936. A deliciously shaped mouth is a mouth made for smooching, and smooching leads to, well, you know. We also learn about Ellen's shapely legs, something that many future Domino Lady artists will make sure to include in their illustrations. Ellen is described as wearing a green nightgown of very thin silk, and we get a very descriptive paragraph about her figure. One neat detail is the fact Ellen's phone has a tinkling ring that Ellen had specially installed because she disliked the usual jangling ringtone. It plays into a privileged background and implies a certain haughtiness to her character. This apartment is essentially Ellen's own little world that she controls to the minutest level. Another demonstration about how in control she is. She also answers the phone with a sing-song tone since she, quote, never knows who's on the other end, and she warns Eloise not to talk too much about the Wyatt affair because, quote, you never know who's listening. It shows that she's supremely cautious regarding secrets and indicates she's smart enough to not blab everything over the telephone. Maybe even a touch of paranoia? After this, we get a steamy shower scene that explicitly turns Ellen on, and a vivid description of Ellen changing into a black velvet negligee. This is par the course for a spicy pulp, and it's going to get spicier the deeper we go, believe me. Another element that is typical for Spicy's and the Domino Lady's world is the overall sleaziness of the world, in this case 1930s Los Angeles. In particular, it's mentioned that Eloise's husband Lou is many years her senior, and there's a strong implication that Eloise cheated on him for unfulfilled sexual desires. So this confirms the old man marrying an attractive trophy wife trope is not new. There's also a brief mention that Eloise was a dancer before marrying Lou, but it's left vague over whether this dancing was the artistic kind or the burlesque kind. If it's the latter, that might provide a firm reason for Eloise marrying a much older man. I mean, it's the middle of the Great Depression, and Lou is a studio executive, and Hollywood is one of the few industries that is booming during this period. Much like how Ellen's thefts support her own lifestyle, maybe Eloise has found a way to survive this rough economic period in her own way. She might have gone to Berkeley, but I can say from experience that college degrees only get you so far. All of these elements regarding Eloise and Lou's relationship aren't really discussed much, but I think it definitely adds to the seediness of Hollywood in this story. Lou is heavily implied to have married a younger woman for her looks, and Eloise is cheating on him for her own sexual fulfillment. The text never explicitly condemns either one of them for these actions, but the closest thing to reproach is toward Eloise, who the text says was indiscreet in her affair with Rob Wyatt, and Ellen privately lambasts her for her foolishness, almost as if the text is implying that Eloise not covering her tracks well enough was worse than the actual infidelity. While I think Lou and Eloise's relationship is primarily here to highlight the sleaziness of Hollywood, I do think it puts an interesting spin on the Domino Lady's mission. Instead of trying to prove infidelity like a lot of PIs and other pulp heroes would do in this time period, she's trying to hide her friend's unfaithfulness so she won't be divorced and turned out to the streets. Anderson is, intentionally or otherwise, reversing the infidelity trope and putting a more sympathetic spin on an adulteress that many other stories of this time wouldn't do. So after changing into her negligee, Ellen writes a letter to Rob Wyatt as the Domino Lady, and tells him she's coming for him at midnight. She gives him a deadline of sending the letters to Eloise by then. This is actually an important part to talk about. In a lot of these earlier Domino Lady stories, she would openly tell her victims the exact time she was coming for them, giving them a chance to give up what they have to her, though of course they never do. Again, it demonstrates the arrogance of the Domino Lady that is on display in this story. You can see just how confident she is that she's going to get what she wants. There are so few doubts in her mind that she'll flat out tell Rob Wyatt when she's coming and still steal from him without worry. What's interesting is that this contacting the victim and notifying when they'll be robbed action is something not a lot of modern writers for the Domino Lady do. I suspect they leave this element out because, well, they have common sense. They know that the best way to get caught during a heist is telling people the exact time and date you'll be robbing them. But I will admit, it's an element of the Domino Lady I enjoy because 1, it shows how much confidence the Domino Lady has. 2, it illustrates that need for excitement and adventure that Ellen shows throughout these early pulp stories, to the point that she actually makes things harder for herself just to up the difficulty of her missions. And 3, it's a way to show Ellen's immaturity because she's essentially bragging to these men in the most brazen way possible that she'll steal their stuff. Her braggadocious nature is actually a subtle character flaw that I think could be examined in a creative way by a modern author. But a lot of modern authors tend to show a more grounded and focused Domino Lady that usually doesn't have this arrogance as a character flaw, at least to this degree. I actually missed this element of her in modern stories, but I can see why many don't include it. And as we'll see in later pulp stories, Lars Anderson does noticeably soften the Domino Lady's personality in regards to her arrogance. There's also this line describing her writing the letter to Rob Wyatt that I really like. Quote, "For a long moment she was busy, writing in her usual perfect flowing chirography, which was so indicative of her impressive personality." Even doing something as simple as writing a letter is treated as an awe-inspiring act by Anderson. Her handwriting is as flawless as Ellen herself is perfect in her beauty. And this amazing ability is treated as just another demonstration of how marvelous and admirable Ellen is as a specimen of femininity. Through her demeanor and the smallest of details like these, Anderson is doing a good job of hyping up Ellen and her alter ego for the reader. Even the smallest things she does are perfect and sexy. How amazing will her nighttime adventure be? So all of this is gleaned by the end of the first chapter, and we've already got a strong feeling for this Domino Lady character, and are interested in how she's going to pull this heist off. We now move on to chapter 2, and I'm going to read the first 2 paragraphs of the chapter because they spell out the Domino Lady's motivations, and are a great intro to the character proper after the in media res opening. Quote, "Owen Patrick had been one of the most feared politicians in California at one time. An assassin slug had put a period to his career 3 years before, and there were those who believed the killer to have been a hired gunman in the employ of the state machine. The big Irishman's dauntless spirit and keen wit had been transplanted in his only child, Ellen. Before her father's untimely death, the girl had lived a life of comparative ease as befitted the child of Owen Patrick. She had spent 4 years at Berkeley, a year in the Far East, and then a cowardly bullet had robbed her of the one who meant more to her than life itself. Small wonder, then, that she pursued the life of a ruthless, roguish adventuress, at times accepting nigh impossible undertakings simply for the sake of friendship and the love of adventure. At other times she was coldly involved in hazardous schemes merely to embarrass the authorities, whom she blamed for her father's death, at the same time earning an adequate income wherewith to obtain the luxuries to which she had become accustomed. Of late she had become well known and feared as the Domino Lady." Now, I really like these 2 paragraphs because they spell out a lot of great motivation for the Domino Lady without taking all that much time from the adventure at hand. This is not an easy thing to do, since backstory is one of those things many writers want to go into detail about. However, Lars Anderson smartly gives us enough to give the Domino Lady a motive so that we, the readers, can understand her crusade, but not so much info that she loses her mystique. After all, we were just introduced to this character and are still unsure how she's going to steal Eloise's letters back. We know plenty about her past now, but the present still has a narrative tension to it. Regarding her backstory, the dead father figure is always a reliable hero origin trope. But there's many interesting facts established here that really help the Domino Lady stand out as a heroine. For starters, the circumstances of Owen Patrick's death. In a previous episode, I implied one of the LA mobs killed Owen Patrick, and that is still a possibility, but this story's explanation heavily suggests the mastermind was the corrupt state machine of California. That's an interesting direction to take because, historically, a lot of the pulps of this time were not that deeply critical of the police and political figures. Like, there are dirty cops and crooked politicians in many pulps, but they're generally treated as perversions in the system. They're just bad guys who have wormed their way into these positions. It's not meant to be an indictment of the whole system. But the Domino Lady opens with this explicit idea that it was a corrupt California political machine that killed her father, and that Owen's death was the machine taking out a threat to their power. And not a fictional city or unnamed county filled with regional corruption, but an entire real-life state controlled by criminals. It's fascinating seeing this element of roguishness to the Domino Lady where she's fighting against an explicitly corrupt system, instead of the more moderate stance of fellow pulp heroes fighting bad apples in otherwise well-intentioned police and political power structures. Already, the Domino Lady is setting herself apart from several of her contemporaries. There are also a lot of neat details in these two paragraphs that very efficiently set up Ellen's character. For instance, I like how the text casually mentions that Owen and Ellen are of Irish descent. I kind of assumed this from the start, since Patrick is the most Irish name you could have, but it's cool that the text outright confirms their Celtic background. I also like how the text mentions that Ellen achieved her, quote, dauntless spirit and keen wit, unquote, from her father. It perfectly sets up this situation where we'll see this spirit and wit come into play later in the story. The line, life of comparative ease, is important too, because it shows how her life was never particularly hard until she was jolted by Owen's death. The fact that her father, quote, meant more to her than life itself, does a good job of demonstrating why she'd be so fearless, and even implies a possible death wish with her activities. Notice also how the text says the Domino Lady has become well known and feared, just like how her father was described as being feared. And as we'll discuss in a little while, there's a slight Oedipal tinge to Ellen devoting so much of her life to avenging a father figure and cycling through several male romantic partners in this journey of justice. The next thing I want to talk about is the story giving a pretty definitive timeline of Ellen Patrick's life leading up to her vigilantism. She is said to spend 4 years at the University of California, Berkeley, then 1 year traveling in the Far East, then Owen is killed and she becomes the Domino Lady, and this story is now taking place 3 years after Owen's death. This is interesting because it provides 8 years of history. Later on, the text will say Ellen is 22 years old, which is odd, because if it was 8 years ago that she started college, she would have been 14. I have a suspicion this was just a mistake by Lars Anderson, and he probably meant she was more around 25 or 26, since that would make more sense than getting into college at age 14. I know that does sometimes happen, but I doubt that was Lars Anderson's intention. Let's return to Ellen's age for a moment. Being 25, 26 is actually pretty unique among pulp heroes, as it was a common trend to make them be in their mid-30s or even 40s when they fought crime. Male pulp heroes like the Shadow, the Spider, Doc Savage, the Whisperer, and so on tended to have a backstory of having served in World War I, and thus tend to not be strapping young lads in their 20s, but men on the cusp of middle age, if not already middle-aged. While we're used to younger superheroes today like Spider-Man or Blue Beetle, the Domino Lady's youth is pretty unique for this era of heroes. Though it should be pointed out that there were other pulp heroines like Sally the Sleuth and Olga Mesmer who were said to be youthful too. I think this youth also ties into the aforementioned arrogance and braggadocious nature of the Domino Lady at this point, since most people would buy a young 20-something having this inflated view of oneself instead of a more learned person in their mid-30s. She even haughtily describes herself at one point as the Young Avenger, explicitly drawing attention to her youth as a brag-worthy fact. Again, I don't think a lot of modern writers highlight the Domino Lady's youth quite this much. A lot of modern Domino Lady stories are more ambiguous about her age, though I've always gotten the vibe that she's written and drawn more like she's in her late 20s, sometimes even her early 30s. Again, I suspect this is to highlight the Domino Lady as experienced and worldlier than this story's more brash and arrogant version. Again, it's a decision that makes sense for the stories modern writers tell, but it is something that I find cool in this early version of the character. Another thing these paragraphs say is that Ellen has been the Domino Lady for 3 years. So the Domino Lady Collects is not an origin story, but simply us jumping into the first adventure Lars Anderson is willing to write about. It's also interesting how in this story, the Domino Lady emphasizes her love of adventure and stealing for luxury more than stealing for charity. The Robin Hood element of the Domino Lady, where she donates most of the gains from her heist to charities, does pop up in later Anderson stories, but modern Domino Lady writers emphasize this element of the character a lot. Most make it a point that Ellen gives most of her stolen goods for charity and keeps only a little bit for herself for operating costs. But the Domino Lady Collects does not feature this charity element at all. The text only says that Ellen steals for favors to friends, for fun, for embarrassing the authorities, or providing, quote, adequate income for the luxuries she'd become accustomed. Again, this is a really interesting characterization. I'd actually argue this is the most anti-heroic the Domino Lady gets in these original pulp stories. And I don't mean villainous, I mean anti-heroic as in the traditional definition of not having the standard traits of a hero. Because when you really think about it, aside from helping out Eloise, everything else Ellen does in the story is frankly pretty selfish. Even helping Eloise could be seen as Ellen just taking advantage of an unfortunate situation and using it to fabricate an adventure for her own amusement. Some folks may balk at this portrayal of the Domino Lady, but I actually kind of enjoy this more self-centered version of Ellen because there's a lot you can do with her character-wise. There's room to tell stories where she realizes her focus on her own desires can come at the cost of others. In fact, one of the pulp stories coming up, Emeralds Aboard, plays with that idea. This is another element modern Domino Lady writers don't tend to focus on because there's more emphasis on her heroic nature. For instance, in the Nancy Holder comic series, she'll go and investigate crimes that neither she nor anybody she knows have any real stake in. The typical superhero act of looking for any kind of problem in their turf and trying to solve it. But the Domino Lady here in the Domino Lady Collects, I don't think she'd be doing that. She really is rather selfish in the story, being presented more as stealing to support herself and her luxuries than any real sense of enacting justice. And remember, she's doing this right in the middle of the Great Depression, when most people in America didn't have even a fraction of the luxuries she gets through her thefts. So part of me wonders if Lars Anderson added the charity element later on because he realized having a rich, daredevil adventuress who came from a wealthy background and lived a life of ease, going around stealing mostly for her own benefit while 1/3 of the country was starving, might not have been a character many readers would root for. That's my personal suspicion, at least. So now we'll move along with the story. And further into Chapter 2, we are introduced to Rob Wyatt, the main antagonist. In the first chapter, Ellen Patrick accepted an invitation from Wyatt to his party that night because Wyatt is infatuated with Ellen and is an infamous Hollywood womanizer. Since Ellen is one of the most beautiful women in LA, he is extremely interested in Ellen for reasons you can guess. Wyatt is described as a character actor in Hollywood productions and a big game hunter known for throwing wild parties. The text also says that Wyatt, quote, was noted for his triumphs in the wild places, but his hunting was not strictly confined to the carnivore. Very melodramatic. And it's said that this womanizing was how Wyatt got Eloise's letters during an affair they had with one another. And he's blackmailing Eloise pretty much for giggles. He's already wealthy as hell and doesn't need any more money. He's doing it because, well, he's a sex pest in Hollywood, which is sadly not uncommon. Hollywood is just one of those areas that breed many people who lord their power over others for their own amusement and satisfaction. So in a way, Rob Wyatt and the story itself have actually aged really well in a post-Harvey Weinstein world. Anyway, Ellen goes to Rob Wyatt's party that night, which is really convenient because the Domino Lady has promised to visit the party herself. The party is described as being wild, but by 1930s standards, which means folks are doing a lot of kissing and heavy petting. It doesn't get more explicit than that, but spices of this era often required you to use your imagination a bit to hype up the eroticism. There's actually a document that discusses the rules and regulations of spicy pulp writing, written by a spicy pulp editor talking about the limits of sensuality a spicy pulp can show. I'll link it in the description. Throughout this wildness, Ellen is really playing up that fawning, somewhat dim-witted blonde type many people see her as. So there's already a performance going on for Rob Wyatt, and this performance is something that I think is really important for the Domino Lady. It's not usually emphasized much in modern Domino Lady stories, but in these original pulps, there are often attempts on Ellen's part to portray herself as dim or vapid in a way that makes men drop their guard around her. As we'll see in later pulp stories, this is a handy tactic to squeeze information out of certain men. Here with Rob Wyatt, it's a way to ask him about his guards and security in a way that doesn't arouse suspicion. It is also revealed to us that Rob Wyatt is running for Lieutenant Governor of California, which again is highlighting this interesting relation the Domino Lady has to politics, and in a much more obvious way than a lot of other pulp heroes were. Many pulp stories were either taking place in fictional cities where you didn't really know where the state was, or you had ones like The Shadow where it was obviously in New York City, but they didn't get deep into the politics of the Big Apple. So the fact that our very first villain is a man who is trying to become lieutenant governor, the second in command of California, and is already a notorious womanizer, exploiter, and blackmailer, it raises a bleak implication about the political system of California. Again, not something a whole lot of other pulps were doing at the time, at least as explicitly. So Ellen and Wyatt are at the party, and Wyatt is just enamored with Ellen. He's falling over himself, complimenting her, and he reveals he's hosted so many parties in the hopes that she would come to them. And he's really putting on the charm and trying to make sure Ellen joins him upstairs, if you know what I mean. And what's fascinating is that Ellen is actually into it. She knows Rob Wyatt is a scoundrel from Eloise and what she's heard about his parties, but he's handsome enough that she's into him and trying to resist his charm. And he's just laying it all on her. He takes her on a tour of his balcony and shows her the beautiful LA skyline below his mansion. He toasts with champagne that Ellen loves, takes her for a dance. Just showing her the absolute best of times. Like, you could earnestly see why woman would fall for him. For a moment, Ellen actually forgets that she's there to steal the letters back, and it really is fascinating because it highlights how much Ellen has a weakness for men. This is something that pops up again in both these original pulps and later authors, because when you really look at Ellen, she is very man-hungry. The pulps say it in a classier way, but they make it clear she is sleeping around with quite a few men. And this story highlights how Ellen's love for adventure and lust for life are both helpful in the lifestyle she's chosen, but also a detriment because falling easily for men isn't the best weakness to have when you're stealing from them. Speaking of man hunger, there's an article by Chris Gaviler that talks about the Domino Lady in terms of the underlying sexuality of the character. I'll leave a link to it in the description for you guys to read. But to summarize, he argues that there's this very charged sexuality with Ellen Patrick, who uses her alter ego as a sort of disassociation method. The Domino Lady is essentially the way of keeping her from submitting to her desire for a steady man, making sure she never gives in to, quote, her other lovers, men who could make her surrender herself and give in to the affection she starved for. And while he never goes as far as to name-drop Sigmund Freud, Gaviler does point out that there's a very noticeable tie-in with Owen Patrick to his daughter's nighttime proclivities, saying, quote, like Batman, Ellen's daddy-avenging mission is all that gets her off. And, in the end, Ellen climbs into bed alone again, still anticipating the romance she defers, still only vaguely cognizant of the emptiness of her lonely existence. She's still Daddy's girl, after all. From this, it's very easy to read the constant flow of men in Ellen's life and her man-hunger as Ellen trying to rediscover that father figure she lost when Owen Patrick was killed and left her with this, quote, lonely existence. And I do think there is a minor Freudian element throughout these original pulp stories. Maybe not an Oedipus or Jocasta complex, but definitely a trying to find a new father figure and doing so through sexual relationships element. It's not all that odd of a perspective when you remember that these original pulp stories were coming out in the 1930s, back when Freud's ideas about libido and sexual development via parental relationships were still very much in vogue throughout American and European psychology and wider culture in general. So I could totally see a spicy writer tapping into Freudian philosophy to a certain extent. As the chapter goes on, we get a description of what Ellen is wearing, described as wearing a high-necked brown frock that covers her body entirely, but still snugly enough to show off her form. The dress is also stated to be inspired by, quote, the Russian fashion, which I'm not familiar with. I've looked up the Russian fashions of the 1930s and get pictures like these on screen, so I'm guessing it was a dress close to these outfits. She also wears brown earrings and a, quote, white silken cape trimmed in white fur. 3 guesses if that piece of fashion is going to be important later on. We also get another demonstration of Ellen's ego when she sees Wyatt checking her out and she remarks, Rob Wyatt's eyes were but paying her the homage she deserved. To paraphrase the band LMFAO, Ellen's sexy and she knows it. Just absolutely bathing in the appreciation of her own glory. It's actually pretty great in terms of demonstrating her massive self-confidence. So the party goes on, and Ellen, in a pretty clever manner, finds a way to cajole Rob Wyatt into talking about the Domino Lady. And he scoffs and says, oh, she might come tonight, but it's not a problem. I've got all these guards located here and there. They're protecting me and won't let her get to me. And Ellen is pretty smart about this. She says, well, why don't you call the police? And he says, oh, it's strictly a private matter. I don't want it to be a big snafu in the papers or anything. And you know, with my campaign for the lieutenant governorship coming up, I just don't want that kind of attention. Yeah, I'm sure he doesn't. And while I might be making it sound like a dumb exposition dump, Lars Anderson finds a clever way for all this info to come out. Ellen is smart. She only prods him a little bit and basically lets Wyatt's egotistical nature take over because he's trying to impress Ellen. He doesn't spill his guts, but he tells Ellen just enough, and she uses that to figure out how to avoid Wyatt's guards. She actually stops short of asking him certain things because she knows he'll get pretty suspicious about all these questions about his guards and the Domino Lady. It's a very fun dialogue sequence that shows both Ellen's acting abilities and Wyatt's simultaneous arrogance and concerns about the Domino Lady's interference. Anderson also frames Wyatt and Ellen's back and forth like a fencing match, and Wyatt is treating their talk as essentially foreplay. Ellen can act all cutesy and demure all she wants, but Wyatt is so self-assured that he knows she's going to jump into his bed by night's end. It's essentially Wyatt transplanting his love of hunting animals into seducing women, and the longer the thrill of the hunt can be extended, the sweeter the final catch will be. This not only provides a plausible reason why Wyatt would talk so much to Ellen, but it also draws a neat parallel between Ellen and Wyatt. Both are these charismatic figures who have high opinions of themselves and go through lovers like cards in a deck, but who use their charms for completely opposing reasons. This is a clever way to not only create conflict, but it also holds a mirror up to Ellen with a character who is surprisingly similar to her. The best villains are the ones who reflect the hero in some way, but also give the hero a chance to demonstrate how they're different. Anderson uses Wyatt to show how, For all her faults, Ellen isn't a sadist who hurts and threatens others out of petty cruelty. It's a subtle way to show her character traits in the story without overshadowing the heist itself or the erotic elements. So Ellen and Wyatt do their dance, and Ellen is just falling deeper and deeper under Rob Wyatt's spell. One interesting detail about this scene, Anderson mentions that the song playing during their dance is called When I Grow Too Old to Dream, which was actually a well-known pop song at the time. It was written by Oscar Hammerstein, who many probably know as half of the writing duo Rodgers and Hammerstein, who wrote quite a few popular Broadway musicals like Oklahoma, South Pacific, and The Sound of Music. It had been featured in the 1935 movie The Night is Young, so this was a fairly well-known and topical song to use at the time. Going back to the story, Ellen and Wyatt embrace and do a deep kiss, Ellen just totally falling for him. But then Ellen comes to her senses and asks to go to the powder room. Coincidentally, Rob Wyatt gets a phone call and has to leave too. So the perfect excuse for Ellen Patrick to disappear and the Domino Lady to appear. She changes into her Domino Lady gear, and as I mentioned in the first episode, the Domino Lady's costume was not originally the white dress, black cape ensemble that most people are familiar with today. It was originally a black dress with a white cape ensemble, and this is the costume that is shown in this story. One thing to note, however, is that the dress shown on the cover and the one shown in the interior are not the same. The one on the cover is done by Norman Saunders, who was a very prolific pulp magazine cover artist. And while the costume itself isn't the modern version we're used to, the costume itself is pretty close to what most people think of when they think of the Domino Lady. The long flowing dress that grips her body tightly, no sleeves or shoulder straps with the shoulders bare, it has a cleavage window, and the dress is backless. It's pretty much what people think of as the Domino Lady costume. Obviously there are some slight variations over the years, as we'll see later on, but the foundational aspects of the costume are right there on Saunders' cover. But when you read the story and check out the interior art, the dress is noticeably different. The dress goes up to her neck and has long sleeves covering virtually all of her body save her hands and face. It's almost a turtleneck with how little skin is showing. The only real similarity to Saunders' version is the dress being tight and black. In terms of faithfulness to the text, the cover version is closer to what is described because the dress is stated to be, quote, black, backless, and daringly cut in at its décolletage. That basically means there's a lot of cleavage, something the interior art does not show. I don't know why the interior artist, who is unknown, drew the dress this way, as he obviously had text references to draw on just as Saunders did. But his version is notably weaker than Saunders', particularly since with the Domino Lady wearing all black, it's a bit hard to make out her figure. As anybody can tell you, people wear black for when they don't want to show their body, which makes it hard to be erotic when your main heroine's figure can't really be made out. I suspect Norman Saunders drew the dress the way he did because he thought a little skin was needed to be tantalizing, and it's the better version of the dress for that. But this is just another demonstration of how the Domino Lady's design changed and adapted as the pulp stories went on. In the next story we're covering, The Domino Lady Doubles Back, the interior artist does the Domino Lady's costume much closer to how Saunders did it, with a shoulderless dress and a much bigger cleavage window. It's also interesting because the story makes it clear that during the party, Ellen is wearing a long brown dress that covers her arms and goes up her neck. It's basically covering up her Domino Lady dress. That's how she's able to change so quickly. She just rips off her cover dress and adds the domino mask. But I'm looking at this interior art and I'm thinking, you're wearing two long-sleeve dresses in Los Angeles during the spring? That must be hot. To be fair, the story does say that the Domino Lady dress is so thin that it can be easily stored, but I don't know, long sleeves still seem counterintuitive in Southern California. She also does not change out of the white cape she is wearing, which I find odd since you would figure Ellen wouldn't want to wear anything she herself wore while doing her Domino Lady activities. My guess is that Anderson was assuming that the white cape wouldn't stand out much in a Hollywood party of the time, and thus nobody would really think much of the fact Ellen and the Domino Lady were wearing the same kind of cape. Anderson is smart enough to have Ellen not wear the cape when she's at less formal gatherings in later stories, so I assume he had her wear the cape in both identities here just to keep things moving along. And as I mentioned before, this cape is said to be silk, but also, quote, trimmed with white fur. This detail doesn't seem to pop up in later stories, with both the white and black versions of the cape said to be just smooth silk. Probably the fur was removed for simplicity of detail, or because fur can more easily be caught on things than silk, something our cat burglar main character would not want happening. Modern Domino Lady artists definitely don't include the fur detail, probably because this is the only pulp story the fur shows up in, and because a smooth cape is easier to draw than one trimmed with fur. This is also the moment that introduces the Domino Lady's automatic pistol. It is only described as being small and black, so in terms of cartridge or model type, we don't know what it is at this point. I've said before that a lot of modern writers tend to give her a .45, probably because that's the de facto gun of choice for other pulp heroes, but the interior art for this story makes it clear that this is not a .45 or any high-caliber pistol. It has to be a .22 with how small it is, and that caliber makes sense given .22s don't make as much noise compared to a lot of other guns. I've fired some .22s that are only a little louder than a BB gun. A .22 that is small and isn't loud makes sense for the cat burglar shenanigans Domino Lady does. She also dons her domino mask for the first time, here described as being colored black and made of shining silk. Unlike her costume, the domino mask remains consistent throughout the rest of the pulp run, probably because there's not much to adjust to it. Also, the text mentions her wearing black heels, and a lot of modern stories portray her having these too, though sometimes varying in color. It's a bit confusing though, since the text at one point refers to them as slippers, which we generally think of today as those light, fluffy shoes you wear around your house. But I looked it up, and apparently slippers was an old expression for women's dancing shoes, as well as women's pumps, which are heels that are around 2.5 to 3.5 inches tall and have no fastener. These are in contrast to stilettos, which are the highest of the high heels. I learned a lot about women's fashion in the research for this episode. Anyway, with Ellen fully costumed and gun at the ready, Chapter 3 begins. Using the information Wyatt gave her, Domino Lady sneaks around the mansion and gets into Wyatt's office. She goes to his desk and she's shifting through the papers trying to find Eloise's letters, and we get a scene in Ellen's head. She's initially smiling to herself as she roots through the desk, gleeful at the thought of Wyatt's face when he realizes his desk has been tampered with. But then Ellen starts thinking about her father's body being found riddled with bullets. This is cool because we learn Owen's body was found in the Keyser building. Keyser. I have not been able to find any building called that in Los Angeles, and there are actually a lot of Keyser buildings throughout the USA and other cities, so I'm assuming it's just a generic name Anderson picked for the body's location. If you know of a building called Keyser or something similar to that in the LA area, post it in the comments. It would be neat to check it out. The scene is also cool because it shows the dichotomy of the Domino Lady's reasons for committing her thefts, at least at this point in her career. She gains a certain satisfaction seeing these powerful men get humiliated, but she also has the desire to enact punishment for her father's death and hinder the state machine. This is actually the justification Ellen uses to antagonize Wyatt in this passage, since he, quote, was ambitious for position of power in the state. She does mention Eloise's blackmail as another reason, and Anderson does emphasize both, but there's an interesting debate to be made over whether Ellen is doing this more for her friend, or more for her own selfish opportunity to screw with the state machine. So anyway, Ellen's looking for Eloise's letters through the desk when she discovers a bombshell. Rob Wyatt, the arrogant sex freak committing blackmail, was involved in political corruption. Shocking, I know. Essentially, Wyatt was selling the water rights to a local valley to some unseen benefactors, who were in turn going to fix the governor election so he could become lieutenant governor and then could legally swipe the water rights from the locals of the valley and give them to these wealthy benefactors. Now, if that sounds like a weirdly familiar plot to any of you, that's because this is a similar plotline to the famous neo-noir film Chinatown. The villain's main plan in that movie was buying up property outside LA and cutting off the water to run off the inhabitants so he could buy the land cheap. Interestingly enough, the valley mentioned in the Domino Lady Collects is called Owens Valley, which is a real valley in California that's located near the Nevada border next to the Sierra Nevada mountains. And Owens was actually the center of something called the California Water Wars, which was where the city of Los Angeles diverted much of the water in Owens Valley towards LA instead of the residents of Owens Valley, essentially in a bid to run the local residents off their land by cutting off the water supply for their crops and buying up their land cheaply to expand the Los Angeles aqueduct. It was a big news item back in the mid and late 1920s, so Lars Anderson was likely aware of it from the newspapers of his day. It was the California Water Wars that also inspired Chinatown, so this is definitely an idea folks love returning to when talking about Los Angeles' historical corruption. It's also interesting because, as I've said before, a lot of other pulp stories would not have used a real political scandal for one of their stories. The closest most pulps would have gotten is something like the Shadow story Kings of Crime, where the Shadow fought a crime group in Atlantic City. However, the city's name was changed to Seaview City because, a slight spoiler here, it's revealed one of the city's governmental figures was heading the crime ring. The Shadow publishers Street and Smith realized that calling the Atlantic City government corrupt would have ruffled some feathers. Though let's be honest, Prohibition-era Atlantic City absolutely was corrupt. Just watch an episode of Boardwalk Empire. So the city's name was changed, despite Seaview City pretty obviously being Atlantic City with all the gambling halls, casinos, and even the story's climax happens on the city's famous boardwalk. Obviously, the Domino Lady does not fight any real-life politicians involved in the California Water Wars in this story, but the fact that they were even willing to name-drop the Owens Valley having a water rights dispute is definitely braver than many other pulps of the time would have been. Also, does anyone else find it interesting that Ellen discovers corruption involving Owens Valley while avenging her father, Owen Patrick? Was Lars Anderson purposefully trying to imply something by this? Or was Owen's name just coincidentally the same as the real-life valley? Let me know in the comments if you think it means anything. Anyway, back to the story. Domino Lady gets a bit triggered by this new revelation considering she blames the state machine for her father's death, and the knowledge that Rob Wyatt is not only a sleazeball but also a corrupt politician. Well, Ellen was the exact wrong person to find that out if Rob Wyatt wanted to be elected. So she's looking at this evidence, and of course Rob Wyatt walks in at that moment, because there needs to be some conflict. One detail I noticed about this scene, Rob Wyatt is described as no longer wearing his dress suit, but a dressing gown, which is essentially a loose robe you wear when you're lounging around the house. Basically like a bathrobe. And it was also not uncommon to be wearing nothing else under the gown if you were really comfortable. So Anderson is providing a very charged image of Wyatt here, with him essentially ready to disrobe at any point and make things hotter than they already are. It's a classic spicy pulp tactic of implying sexual possibilities and letting the reader's mind run away with the possibilities. And while Anderson undoubtedly has Wyatt in this gown just to enhance the spiciness, I think it's also a clever way to show Rob Wyatt's arrogance. My personal theory is that he changed into the gown for Ellen's sake, assuming she would return, fall into his arms, and come to his bed. And let's just say a dressing gown is easier to remove than a suit. He was so sure that Ellen would fall for him that he dressed to make the occasion easier. That is, certainly some next-level confidence right there. So while keeping Rob Wyatt at bay with her gun, Domino Lady tells him she's got the dirt on him, and she'll destroy him. While Wyatt is a bit unnerved by his threat, he stays mostly calm and points out he's got guards all around the mansion, and there's no way she's escaping. And it becomes kind of a Mexican standoff because Wyatt points out that the guards will swarm her the second she leaves, and Rob Wyatt calls for their attention, but Domino Lady points out that he'll be the first one got if the gun goes off. And then the Domino Lady does something that I don't think a lot of writers nowadays would have her do. She makes a deal with Wyatt saying she'll trade the water rights evidence for Eloise's letters. Rob Wyatt agrees, and more surprisingly, Domino Lady actually keeps her promise. She doesn't try to swipe the water rights evidence back at any point after she gets the letters, which is a demonstration of honor in her case, though I think it's a bit weird because maybe I'm just a cynical opportunist, but I would get the letters from Rob Wyatt, knock him out, and then steal the incriminating evidence right back. Is that just me? No? Maybe. Maybe Lars Anderson was trying to suggest a more virtuous side of the Domino Lady after showing her throughout most of the story as a selfish rogue, showing she's willing to give up bombshell evidence for her friend's benefit. If so, kind of a weird way to go about it. I'm not sure all those locals in Owens Valley who are going to lose their water rights would appreciate it. Though in fairness, she does tell Wyatt that she'll be out to get him from this day forward, and that she'll never stop until he's punished. So at the very least, she's not letting him rest easy. I love her line when she says this too. I'm out to get you from this moment forward, and the Domino Lady never fails to deliver. Absolutely perfect. So Domino Lady gets the letters and puts the documents in a pocket inside her cape. This is another mainstay for the Domino Lady, as Anderson likely realized it would be hard to carry things in that thin dress, and knew the cape would be an easy storage place that wouldn't be cumbersome. Virtually every other writer has kept the cloak pockets because they make a lot of sense. So once she's secured the documents, she makes Rob Wyatt face the wall, and while he's cursing her out, she reaches into her cape pocket and injects Wyatt with a hypodermic needle behind his right ear that renders him unconscious near instantaneously. This is, of course, the introduction of the Domino Lady's famous syringe of knockout formula. And what's fascinating is that while the syringe is known to Domino Lady fans today, its reveal here is actually treated as a twist. There's no foreshadowing or mention that Ellen had this syringe beforehand. And it does feel like Lars Anderson pulled this out of his hat just to deal with this dilemma over how to incapacitate Wyatt without having the Domino Lady just shoot him dead. There definitely could have been more clues she had this needle beforehand. Regardless, this syringe is always in the Domino Lady's arsenal from here on out. I also like two details about this scene. First, that the Domino Lady tells Wyatt he'll be in, quote, suspended animation, a wonderfully verbose term for knocking someone out. And second, that the Domino Lady refers to herself in the third person here. Just another great sign of that ego of hers shining through. So Rob Wyatt gets knocked out, and the Domino Lady leaves her famous black calling card that reads, "The Domino Lady's Compliments," in white ink. This is another element that will become a permanent aspect of the Domino Lady's modus operandi. This also feels like another way Anderson highlights Ellen's arrogance. She's announcing to her victims after the fact that she was the one that robbed them. You've lost your valuables, and the card is just her flexing and rubbing more salt into the wound. So the Domino Lady is sneaking back to the room where she left her dress, and Anderson describes the simultaneous exhilaration and fear Ellen feels as she's making her way back. Again, a neat way of showing Ellen's excitement in this heist, as the way she describes the possibility of being discovered feels tense, but also like she vaguely hopes another danger will appear. You can only get thrills if there's a possibility of danger, after all. So she makes her way back to the room, and the line here is really good. It says she was, quote, working with the speed of a burlesque strip artist to get the black dress off her body, in case you needed to be reminded that this was a sleazy story. Once her party dress is back on, she folds up her mask and dress very thinly, and that's another element that will be constant throughout the rest of the Domino Lady stories. Her mask, dress, and in later stories her cloak are stated to be so thin that they can be folded very small, but that also means they're not very thick, so they don't really hide the Domino Lady's form when she's wearing them. Again, this is spicy pulp. You got to have that sleaze factor in this pulp genre. The story then wraps up around here with guests leaving the party and Rob Wyatt's servants saying he's drunk too much and they're putting him to bed. And Ellen, in a very audacious move, mails Eloise's letters back to Eloise by putting it in Rob Wyatt's own mail chute to mail them out the next day. She puts them in the one place Rob Wyatt could find them, but he obviously won't check because who would suspect the Domino Lady of leaving the letters there at the mansion? She basically gives him the old purloined letter treatment of hiding in plain sight. The story then ends with Eloise's husband suspecting nothing, Rob Wyatt silent about the night because he's not going to draw attention to himself with his political office at stake, and Ellen Patrick satisfied with this latest adventure. While she didn't grab the water rights evidence against Rob Wyatt, the final line of the story says she's looking forward to, quote, her next encounter with the handsome hunter who never knew any rules. Again, is she prolonging the chase for her own adventure, even at the risk of the locals of Owens Valley? Is she unintentionally emulating Wyatt's tendency to prolong his own hunts for attractive women? It's an intriguing note to end on, and one that promises plenty more adventure to come. In conclusion, The Domino Lady Collects is a fantastic introduction to the Domino Lady. It establishes a lot of important elements to the character, from her costume to her weapons of choice. The basic setup for a Domino Lady adventure is also set in stone with this tale, with an introductory chapter describing the trouble, the middle section with a heist, and a climactic chapter with high tension and eventual resolution. This is the formula that the pulp stories will generally follow, and indeed even many modern Domino Lady stories follow it as well. We get an extremely magnetic main character who has believable flaws of intense sexual desire and arrogance, and an enjoyable antagonist who represents the absolute worst of Hollywood culture and mirrors Ellen in his seductive personality. In fact, the story does a good job with highlighting the sleaze factor of the Hollywood setting in general, where every beautiful thing is tinged with a certain seediness, including our main heroine. Yet the barrage of sensuality never becomes overbearing in a way that hinders the actual narrative. I also appreciate how the story utilizes the Los Angeles setting to tell an adventure that actually plays into the area's history. This isn't a story that could be transplanted to any other location. It specifically plays into LA's geography and history of corruption, and that makes the tale all the more fascinating. The explicit condemnation of real-life California state politics is likewise pretty gutsy in this era of pulp writing. And all of this is packed into a story that's not even that long. A true demonstration of how pulp fiction can pack a lot of detail and narrative drive into a small amount of space. But while the fundamental elements of the Domino Lady are set here, you can also tell that there are a lot of things Lars Anderson is still trying to figure out with the character. As mentioned, Ellen is a lot more anti-heroic in this story, with her only real redeeming factor being her doing the heist for her friend's benefit. But there is more emphasis on her doing this for adventure, not charity like later stories would have her do. These rougher edges to her character will be smoothed over as time goes on, but it's still interesting seeing this more selfish version of the Domino Lady. You can also see that the Domino Lady's costume is still being tinkered with from the different versions portrayed on the cover and the interior art. The further the pulp stories go on, the more consistent the Domino Lady's costume will become until she reaches the outfit we know and love. So I am going to end the episode here, as I've covered quite a bit about what makes this story so good, and all the facets of it that I find intriguing. I'm going to leave a plug for the Suitors of the Domino Lady social media in the description, both for our Facebook page and our Twitter handle. I'm also plugging the social media and website for the Shadowed Circle magazine. This is a cultural magazine I work for that examines the pulp character, the Shadow. We're actually working on a new issue right now. If you're a Shadow fan, check us out. And if you're not a Shadow fan, you should still check us out because you'll learn some interesting things about the Shadow that may get you more interested in the character. I also wanted to shout out 2 publications that are featuring advertisements for the Suitors of the Domino Lady podcast in their pages. The first is the Doc Talos magazine, which is focused on a Doc Savage pastiche with a more sensual take on the Savage mythos. You should definitely check them out if you'd like to see a more adult-oriented Doc Savage character, or if you want to see pulp with a more explicitly erotic tone. Basically, think Philip Jose Farmer, and you've got an idea of what to expect. The second publication is the science fiction fantasy magazine Sursova, which will feature an ad of ours in their spring issue releasing next month. I've been reading them for several years now, both their magazine and their other book publications, and they're a wonderful sci-fi fantasy publisher that harken back to pulp-style writing. I will post links to both Doc Talos and Sursova's websites in the description. I also wanted to announce some news regarding the podcast schedule. As I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, the podcast started last year, but was heavily delayed by outside influences. As such, I wanted to do a series of makeup episodes that give you all a little something to chew on. You've all been very patient with this podcast, so my plan is that after I cover the 6 original pulp stories by Lars Anderson, I was going to do some shorter mini-sodes that talk about subjects that were not Domino Lady works, but were at least nominally connected to the character in some way. These would be episodes that discuss things like comic superheroines who are inspired by the Domino Lady, Lars Anderson's other works in the spicy magazine genre, the influence the Shadow had on the Domino Lady, and other subjects like that. I also want to do these because there's such a large gap between the Domino Lady's final pulp story and her reintroduction via the 1990 Fantagraphics series that I realized it would feel weird to not talk about her influence during this 54-year drought of new stories. So expect some of those smaller mini-sodes after we're done with the original 6 Domino Lady pulp stories, probably around June or July. Finally, I wanted to pose a question to all of you listening. Should I go to Pulp Fest this year? I bring this up because this year's theme is Spice, Spies, and Shaw, and since the Domino Lady is definitely connected to the spicy magazines being discussed this year, it would make a great deal of sense for me to participate at this Pulp Fest. It would not be through a panel since they've already come out with a schedule and seems like they've already arranged all of them, but I could participate through a vendor stand. I'm thinking of selling things like coasters and small posters with a to-be-disclosed Suitors of the Domino Lady art. The one thing about this is that it means I'll need to find an artist to commission pretty quick, since I don't want to reserve a spot at Pulp Fest if I've got no products to sell. I'd also have to talk with the Pulp Fest staff to know what would be appropriate artwork to display at the convention. They allow kids and teenagers at the convention, so I can't commission a bunch of nude paintings. But assuming that I could arrange artwork in a table there, would any of you attend? If not, would you purchase any of the Suitors of the Domino Lady art or products I could be selling online? Answer in the comments so I can figure out a plan of action sooner rather than later. So yeah, that is all the updates I have for now. so it's time to sign off. Thank you for listening, and good night to all you suitors of the Domino Lady.